You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, which is to provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's conversation, we'll talk about the current state and the future of a topic that has seen a surge in interest over the last few years in companies. And that topic is ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors that companies are considering in today's business environment. I'm very pleased to welcome today our guest, who is Matteo Tonello, the Managing Director of the Conference Board's ESG Center. Matteo, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for having me.
So, Matteo, I just said ESG is an acronym for environmental, social, and governance factors, but what is ESG to companies today? What does it mean to them, and why is it important?
Yeah, I would say that ESG is first and foremost quite plentiful. It really is a wide-ranging concept that covers a variety of different subjects from, climate change mitigation strategies, plastic pollution reduction, there's leadership and workforce diversity in it, employee health and safety, political contribution disclosure, donations to local communities. So there's really a lot, and the common denominator for these subjects is that they all refer to areas of extra financial performance of a company, areas where the performance of the company cannot be quantified and measured using generally accepted accounting principles. It's an acronym that has been around for quite some time, actually, for at least 15 years. It was first used in a paper published by the UN Global Compact, and its history, in a way, is the history of a fringe theory that has gone mainstream over time, because that paper argued that there are investment opportunities in the stock market that can be evaluated based on extra financial metrics of business performance. These are opportunities that pursue profit only indirectly by directly pursuing a broader range of extra financial interests of stakeholders. And the papers simply argue that E, S, and G, these three components, environmental, social, and governance, are examples of extra financial investment criteria and stakeholder interests. So the terminology has existed for a long time, but for a long time it was also relegated to the then small world of socially responsible investors. It has gone mainstream only more recently, with more and more large institutional investors also pursuing ESG strategies, and more corporate leaders, board members, and CEOs publicly acknowledging the value of extra financial performance.
Right. And so when you think about ESG, that's something that usually is discussed with shareholders, right? So the big firms of BlackRock and State Street and Fidelity, those are the folks that you usually think about. But there are a lot of, you mentioned the term stakeholders, which means there are a lot of different folks that should be and are involved with ESG. Maybe you could just run through who are the stakeholders.
Yeah, the concept of stakeholder is also quite broad, and it covers everybody ranging from employees, suppliers, and customers of a company's the local community or global communities in which the company operates.
Yeah, and so this is a big change in ESG too, because we used to think about it as governance and how the company was run, but it's really it's so much broader that it's the broader society that is really the the stakeholder, and hence corporations are citizens of the world, and particularly the multinationals, and so I think that in the broadest terms, don't we really mean that companies need to be sensitive to ESG in the sense that they need to be good citizens of the world?
Yeah, I think what ESG does, it really provides a conceptual framework that enables all of these stakeholders to bring their attention, their interest to the attention of the board of directors and the senior management of the company. So my suggestion to really understand ESG and its implications for business is that when we hear these three letters, we think of the idea that a corporation is a nexus of stakeholders, all of those stakeholders that I mentioned earlier. And a company cannot thrive in the long term by pursuing the short-term interests of shareholders while neglecting the extra financial interests of other key stakeholders. Inevitably, that choice of sort of compromising key stakeholder relations would boomerang on the company and eventually erode the foundations of long-term success and growth of the company. And of course, the pandemic and the increasing attention that is being received in the last couple of years by the racial justice movement, by natural disasters that are linked to climate change, all of these events have further accelerated the mainstream adoption of the ESG terminology.
Right. So it's changed. I mean, if you checked in a few years ago and you were talking about ESG and you check back in today, things have really changed. And of course, the COVID pandemic is part of it. But how else has ESG changed, and what's driven all these changes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think a lot of the change is ultimately driven by the institutional investment community. And we've seen a great deal of this change in the last few years. It has been a somewhat gradual process, and our ESG Center at the Conference Board has been keeping track of these developments over the years. And the number one trend regarding shareholder proposals in the recent proxy seasons has been the steady rise of resolutions pertaining to social and environmental policies of the company. These resolutions used to be a small number until a few years ago, and instead in the 2021 proxy season, they represented 55% of the total number of resolutions filed at S&P 500 companies and 49.5% of the total filed at Russell 3000 companies. So the type of shareholder activity that a few years ago we were seeing on issues of executive compensation, on governance issues like majority voting, or a board classification, that activity has now shifted to the other two letters of ESG, and those that stand for environmental and social.
And a lot of companies have created committees to deal with ESG. I mean, there's always been a nominating and governance committee because that was required by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. But the E and the S part has really become a big focus and integrated into business strategy. And so you're seeing boards create committees to deal with that. But do you think that's going to become a requirement, or do you think that's just going to be a voluntary thing going forward?
Yeah, this is the type of question that we actually get a lot from our members these days, and that is precisely because some companies are looking into how to delegate oversight responsibilities regarding ESG now that ESG is increasingly being elevated to the attention of the board of directors. And the ESG Center at the Conference Board is starting to look into how committee charters are being amended to accommodate the responsibility for ESG oversight. And we are working on a new tool for our benchmarking platform on ESG that maps the delegation of responsibilities to board committees, as well as those situations where companies choose to form a standalone ESG committee. What we are seeing so far in general is that there are tasks that are related to ESG oversight that should be kept at the full board level, or perhaps assigned to a dedicated ESG committee. But the breadth of ESG, the sort of the interdisciplinary nature of ESG, is such that there are also responsibilities that are better performed by the audit and the compensation and the nominating governance committee. And I can get into those. So the full board is better suited to address issues such as the alignment between ESG and strategy, which obviously is a critical issue to allocate resources to ESG. in terms of risk mitigation, risk assessment, and opportunities related to ESG. Also, the full board should probably set the direction that the company should follow with respect to ESG disclosure, given how consequential this is and the fact that ESG disclosure continues to be voluntary for the most part. So, for example, the choice of one or more disclosure frameworks has important consequences and is most likely something that you will want the entire board to discuss.
Yeah, so this, Matteo, this kind of reminds me of the whole subject of risk. I remember a few years ago when, we were trying to figure out as, a corporate community, how do you, what's the right way to oversee risk? And there was a tool that was developed called a Heatmap, which just laid out the various levels, and there were questionnaires sent out to the board members in the various areas of the company saying, what do you think of the most? And then they ranked them on a heat map. And we found that every company was different. Every industry is different. And so this really needs to be a company level kind of exercise. And it strikes me that ERM and ESG are similar. And these ESG issues need to probably have their own heat map and therefore determine what are the biggest risks and opportunities for the companies. And then, divvy it out to the various members of the management team and the board oversight. Is that a good framework?
Yes, it is, because as you said yourself, the companies have been investing significantly over the last 10 or 15 years into the development of cohesive enterprise-wide risk management programs. And so the approach to ESG risk should logically fit into the progress that has been made in that area. And heat maps are one of the tools of an ERM program. What is particularly helpful in the case of heat map is the process that a company needs to follow to compile and maintain one of these heat maps. So the process requires them to regularly scan their business operations and so to detect risks and opportunities related to ESG and to rank those risks and opportunity by urgency, impact level, or a variety of other parameters. And even when applied to ESG heat maps can be quite useful, since there's a lot that is being thrown into the ESG bucket and not everything deserves the same degree of attention. An important guideline to prepare heat maps is to run hypothetical scenarios and assess the impact that certain ESG-related events, say climate change, can have on a company's sources of income and capital. So how dependent those sources of capital are on circumstances that could change if an ESG risk materializes.
We're talking to Dr. Matteo Tonello, the Managing Director of the ESG Center at the Conference Board. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with more of our conversation.
Hi, I'm Eric Schwartzman, author of The Digital Pivot: Secrets of Online Marketing, the first non-technical book for the general business reader that simplifies the process of digital marketing. If you're in marketing, public relations, corporate communications, or promotions, The Digital Pivot explains in simple, jargon-free language exactly what it takes to build an audience and convert sales online. And it also explains your department's role in the digital business landscape. So if you want a digital marketing MBA in a single book with plenty of interesting stories from my 20-year career in digital marketing consulting with Boeing, Toyota, and the U.S. Department of Defense, go to digitalpivotbook.com and order a copy. You can also get an audiobook read by me. And if you're looking for a dynamic speaker to keynote your next event or talk to your group about pivoting to digital marketing, check out my 2021 speaker reel at ericschwartzman.com.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Dr. Matteo Tonello, the Managing Director of the Conference Board's ESG Center. Matteo, we've talked a lot about, what is ESG, how has it changed, certainly what do the letters stand for, yada, yada, yada. But now the question, I guess, is how should boards think about their industry and their company's condition? And do the boards own this, or is it management who owns it, or the board just owns the oversight? Talk about roles and accountabilities, and then who should do what in evaluating this.
Yeah, we go back to the notion of risk management and ERM, and how do you approach new risks. And there's obviously a very important role for the board in overseeing this process, but management is executing a risk management program. And we mentioned, we started to talk a little bit earlier about board committees and the roles that board committees play in the context of ESG. And I talked about the role of the full board, but there are, because of the nature of ESG, there are specific responsibilities that audit committees can play in this context. So, for example, the data collection process and controls is a very important topic that is being discussed now, that companies are starting to disclose more on ESG and obviously need a very rigorous process to gather information on ESG across the internal organization and ensure that information is investor grade. For something like this, it seems quite logical for the audit committee to be providing the oversight, simply because of the experience that audit committee members have matured with respect to disclosure controls and procedures. And similarly, you may want the audit committee to make decisions related to ESG disclosure assurance, which is something that we see happening more and more, where an independent assurer is involved to verify the information. The compensation committee has an important role. What we are seeing is the growing role of compensation committees performed in aligning executive compensation and ESG objectives. On this specific topic, actually, the Conference Board's ESG Center already makes available to its members a screening tool that tracks ESG metrics in incentive plans across the entire Russell 3000, and essentially allows compensation committees to choose metric type and the type of incentive plans, whether annual or long-term incentive, to access granular information on companies that have incorporated that metric in incentive plans. And finally, the Nominating and Governance Committee. ESG raises the question of whether the company board and senior leadership have the skill set and experience necessary to oversee and carry out an ESG-informed strategy. And this is becoming relevant to board recruitment as well as leadership development programs. And it is just logical for the Nominating and Governance Committee to address it, since it's right up their alley.
So if I heard you correctly, the board has delegated the accountability for the strategies, development of the strategies, and the implementation of all the ESG strategies. All of that is delegated to management, but the board as a whole retains all oversight accountability, and then each of the committees has a role in certain slices of that as it relates to their committee. Is that a fair synopsis?
It is, because a lot of this comes down to procedures that have to be established at the company level. And so the oversight role that the board can perform, and the way the board can inform the rationale and the logic behind those procedures is quite critical.
Yeah, and you mentioned these these rating firms out there. There are a lot of frameworks measuring it. There's not one standard yet, is there? And there are a lot of rating firms that are rating ESG, across various companies. So it's a little bit of the Wild West as it relates to how to track, how to rate these things. How should boards think about this? What's the best way to think about a framework?
Yeah, and this is probably the number one issue when it comes to ESG and the challenges that it poses to companies these days. If I look at the body of research on ESG that the Conference Board has developed in the last few years, I see two overarching insights for what's ahead for CEO, corporate leadership, and board member. The first one is that, and we talked about this, it's not a fading phenomenon. There are simply too many forces at play for the focus on ESG to dissipate in the near future. So diminishing it or ignoring it could pose a serious risk for the company at this point. But the second one, and I'm getting to your point, is that a lot of the history of ESG still needs to be written. And so there's a clear need for corporate leadership of a company to contribute to solving the main challenges related to ESG, which are the challenges of establishing materiality standards and the challenges of seeking consensus about the best way to quantify the value of ESG and to optimize ESG data collection and control procedures across organizations, as well as improving data disclosure. And I think there's an important role in some of the answers to these questions will come over time. There's an important role that benchmarking plays in this area, especially now that ESG disclosure is expanding and that more and more disclosure data is becoming available. I mentioned at the very beginning that unlike financial performance, the evaluation of ESG and extra financial performance can be more subjective. There's really not a widely accepted system of accounting for these intangibles and types of performance. So for these reasons, benchmarking and comparative peer analysis can help companies complement their inside knowledge and perception of ESG factors with information from other organizations in the same industry or from other organizations that the company would consider its peers in a certain ESG area.
Yeah, so basically more to come on this, but I think what you're saying is that boards need to be looking to the rating agencies and these outside frameworks and starting to develop the benchmarks that are relevant to their companies and their industries. I guess that's the best we can do at this point until there's more consensus.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key issue here is the issue of materiality, right? And not all ESG issues are created equal. Or maybe it's fair to say that they were all created equal, they all have merit, but the relevance of any single ESG issue at one company can be quite different than another company. And I think that the most important guidance at this stage of the process, while the field continues to develop and standardization happens, is the key concept is that the one that tests the alignment between ESG matters and the business strategy. And the board of directors and the CEO who are directly involved in setting the business strategy really understand what can help to achieve strategic objectives and what is a distraction. In principle, it is true that strategies evolve all the time and that ESG considerations, both considerations of risks and considerations of opportunities, could prompt the board to revise its strategy. However, ultimately, a company has finite resources, and when presented with yet another stakeholder demand, it should draw the line if the demand is not aligned with the business strategy.
Now these ESG issues are popping up all over the world. I mean, we've been talking about this from a U.S. perspective and as governed by the Securities and Exchange Commission in public companies, but there's a whole notion of private companies, but then also public and private companies in nations around the world that also have different frameworks and different laws. And I think that I think most people would agree that some of the European nations are ahead of the United States on these issues. Maybe you could highlight, some of those countries, and what do their rules and what do their practices portend for U.S. ESG?
Yeah, I would say that in the field of social responsibility, which is essentially what has led to the current notion of ESG, European countries in particular have had a framework for disclosure and therefore to understand critical ESG issues that have been in place for some time and that are all rooted on the comply or explain principle, and therefore have probably led in this area. But I think the United States has made significant progress in the last few years alone, and if we look back and consider the history of corporate governance and what has now become more broadly ESG, there has been a very clear journey here. When I started to work in the field of corporate law in the mid to late 90s, there was still a fundamental credo that decisions on the internal organizations and the governance of a company should be left to the company alone. That legislators and regulators and investors, let alone other stakeholders, should stay out of it. And that fundamental view of corporate governance, maybe we can call it, the free enterprise view or the management-centered view of corporate governance. Well, that view began to be questioned in the aftermath of the season of financial scandals that started with Enron in 2001. And the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act really sanctioned the beginning of the end of the era of non-intrusion into corporate affairs. So in the last 20 years, we have seen legislation and regulation ranging from Dodd-Frank, the introduction of say on pay, SEC rules on compensation, enhanced governance disclosure, most recently the rules on human capital management disclosure. Just last week, the SEC staff approving the listing rules at NASDAQ that set a de facto diversity quota system for board composition, even though it's softened by a comply or explain approach. And at least equally important, we've seen over the years a whole set of practices, governance-related mostly practices, being adopted under pressure from shareholders. And I'm referring to majority voting, board classifications, separation of CEO and chair positions, or the introduction of the lead independent directors, and much more. So there's a clear journey here that has taken place. And what we have been witnessing is the gradual shift in the center of gravity of the corporate governance model from a management center model to a shareholder and now stakeholder influenced model. So to go back to your question, certainly other countries have led the way, but I've seen significant progress and movement in this direction in the United States as well.
Yeah, so we're on this journey. All sorts of countries are on their own journeys. There are things to borrow from those other countries, but it's going to be interesting because the U.S. is unique and U.S. domiciled multinationals are unique. So it sounds like something that is a never-ending journey, Matteo.
Yes, never-ending journey. I think as for the future, what is foreseeable at this point in time is some level of coalescing of disparate solution to ESG issues into best practices or maybe prevailing practices, including the practices on disclosure. And I think the real question is whether this will be accomplished by the business community alone, sort of organically, and as a result of reciprocal emulation, even on a global stage, and sort of the gradual appreciation of the value of certain practices, or if the coalescing will be induced by a new wave of regulatory interventions in the field.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Well, we've been talking to Matteo Tonello, the Managing Director of the ESG Center at the Conference Board. Matteo, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. It was a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a leader from one of our centers or other business executives to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing communications, the economy, and human capital. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, and I'm sure that they'll want to listen to all of our available episodes. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.